show. I want to make sure you're in the right place. Welcome to Power Shift, the changing American electorate. I'm Matt Miller, columnist for the Washington Post and host of Public Radio's Week in Review Left, Right, and Center, which is based right here, originating at KCRW-FM in Santa Monica. We are delighted to be having this far-sighted political conversation at a time when everything seems to be changing and many of the old rules no longer apply. If you saw President Obama give his spiel at the White House Correspondents' Dinner the other night, even he realizes that things are changing. He remarked, "I'm just not the strapping young Muslim socialist I used to be." So the sense of change is in the wind everywhere. Now, everyone knows that 2012 was a major political earthquake, may be too strong or hackneyed a word, but a major development. You had the president winning re-election in a race where I would argue he was beatable, given the state of the economy, a terrific accomplishment for his campaign team, but also a reflection, as we'll get into in this panel, of the changing demographics and the composition of the electorate. Ever since then, you've seen on the Republican side a lot of angst and reflection. The party, in some sense, is running around asking questions like, what do Latinos want? And hence the priority and prominence given to the immigration issue. I heard Roger Ailes, within a couple days of the election, was scouting for promising Latino talent to put on air, one cultural indicator of the kind of immediate sense of urgency and change that was felt after the election. But these changes go further, as you know. Unmarried women loomed large, Asian Americans, younger Americans. Now, the conventional wisdom has been that a lot of this tilts against the Republican Party, but the conventional wisdom is often wrong. And what we want to address on this panel is what this all means for the future. And not just for politics, but for policy and for problem solving in an age when most Americans are telling pollsters that the country is on the wrong track, and when globalization and rapid technological change are buffeting the economy and putting at risk the middle class in ways that leave the traditional bromides of both major parties increasingly obsolete. These are obviously huge questions. Luckily, we have a huge panel of thinkers and doers that is equal to shedding definitive light on all of this. In a moment, I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then what we'll do is engage up here in probably 35 or 40 minutes of conversation, leaving ample time for Q&A and dialogue with this informed and engaged audience. So think about your questions, and let's meet our panel. On my right, your left, Joel Benenson, who's president and CEO of Benenson Strategy Group. He was the lead pollster for the Obama campaign. He's been the chief pollster and a senior strategist for the president since the beginning of his 2008 campaign, and worked also on President Clinton's 1996 race. He's also served as an advisor to heads of state, governors, major corporations. Before becoming a pollster, Benenson was a political journalist for the New York Daily News, also worked for Governor Mario Cuomo in his '94 campaign and in the ad business. Welcome to you, Joel. Harold Ford, to my left, your right, is a former congressman, a managing director now at Morgan Stanley Wealth Management. He served 5 terms in the Congress representing Tennessee's 9th District, where he served on the House Financial Services, Budget, and Education Committees. Harold also teaches part-time at NYU's Wagner School of Public Service, and as you know, is a frequent contributor to NBC News. Welcome, Harold.
Thank you, Matt.
Frank Luntz, on our end here, is chairman and CEO of Luntz Global and a contributor on Fox News. He's written, supervised, and conducted more than 2,000 surveys, focus groups, ad tests, and dial sessions in dozens of countries. A man with his finger on the pulse of publics everywhere. He's the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, including his latest book, Win, The Key Principles to Take Your Business from Ordinary to Extraordinary.
How did you describe where he was sitting? Because we won't hear that much about. You say to your far what?
Far left. He's on the far right, that's right, of the audience. And last but not least, of course, is Dan Schnur, to my immediate right and your left. He's the director of the Jesse Unruh Institute of Politics at USC. He also chaired the California Fair Political Practices Commission about a year ago. And Dan was among the state's leading political and media strategists for years, having worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, including John McCain's presidential race in 2000 and 5 years as a chief spokesman for then California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan also writes regularly for the Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico, and as a commentator for CNN, MSNBC, and all those great places. So join me in a brief welcome to say thank you for our panel for joining us. So let's dive in. Joel, why don't I start with you? Lots of angles of vision into what 2012 meant. What's your take to start us off on where this changing political, demographic landscape leads us? And I know you've got a special interest in the values issue as it's reflected in how things are shaping up.
Yeah.
Start us off.
Thank you, and thanks for having us. This is a fun panel. Look, I've said that demographics aren't destiny, that the election in 2012 was ultimately about vision and values. That doesn't mean that you can ignore the demographic shifts that have happened. If you go back just 20 years to 2002, the non-white portion of the voting population was 13%. In 2012, it's more than double that. It's 28%. Now, that in and of itself doesn't tell you where the country's going. But there's a set of value shifts that are happening when you've got generations of people who are living in and growing up in a much more diverse world. If you look, for example, at people under the age of 50, over 60% of them say they have a close friend who was born in another country. If you look at people over 65, only 47% say that. It's a pretty big gap about who your universe is in your social circle. You know, that leads to a set of values around tolerance, around fairness, around acceptance of other people that is creating not just a value shift in America, it also, on the political side, has created a very strong generational divide. Our biggest divide in this country right now is not between left and right. It's actually between under 65 and over 65. It's even more pronounced if you go under 50 and over 50. If you look right now at just people over 65 and under 65 on freedom to marry, seriousness of dealing with climate change, solving immigration, even abortion, there are majorities under 65 supporting action on each of those issues. So I think we're in a time where the social values that have evolved because of the diversity are important, and along with that, there's a shift and a change in economic values that, frankly, I believe President Obama tapped into very well in 2012, and it's the reason why, in the face of a lot of conventional economic metrics that would have said there's no way a president can get elected with a right track number in the 40s or an approval rating hovering around 49%, we actually became only the third Democrat in history to win with 51% or more of the vote 2 times.
A lot of stuff I want to come back to and tease out. Frank Luntz, though, let me get you in. I know you've been thinking about, and you've had research in the field, I think, recently, talking about some of the
Your sheet, Dan. Yeah.
some of the this whole question of polarization and whether there's a way in the wake of the election we just saw, whether folks are going to be able to get together on both sides. And you've got a pessimistic point of view on that. Is that right?
And I want you to start with slide 20. I'm just going to run through
We
three
got
or
some
four
slides,
of these.
folks?
You guys can pull up slide 20. We just finished a survey that was meant to look at the values and priorities and beliefs, not about issues, but about how people thought about life itself. And there's a reason why there's so much polarization. And it's not just that Mitt Romney was not a good communicator. When he used the word self-deportation, you could basically kick whatever, the election goodbye, because you knew that for the Latino population, that was not language that would work. If you can pull up the next slide, on every issue that we have looked at, every expectation among Democrats, much more optimistic about the future than Republicans. 78% of those who identify with the GOP think our best years are behind us. Look at the difference between the Democrats. Almost two-thirds think our best years are ahead of us. So you've got an optimism gap. Next slide, please. In terms even of values, look at the percentage between Republicans and Democrats. America won't be the same country for them that it was for me. We're always asking these questions. What are you afraid of? What are you concerned of? What is your anxiety? And the difference between the GOP and the Democrats is like night and day. But go further down. They're not going to be as successful in life. This is for their children what they're concerned about. Republicans aren't concerned about the individual. They're concerned now about the country. Their fear is for America's future. The Democrats have a much greater feel about their family's future, their kids' future. And so we're not even talking the same issues anymore. Next slide. This is going to set the context for all of this. The difference between embracing and promoting a more tolerant, it is exactly a mirror of itself. And Joel, you and I were talking about this before. How do you find common ground when 80% of Democrats are seeking a more tolerant, open-minded approach, and 80% of Republicans are seeking Judeo-Christian values and traditions that this nation was founded? We are completely different people. It makes sense that we are divided because our basic values aren't the same anymore. All the conservative Democrats disappeared over to the Republicans. All the liberal Republicans disappeared over to the Democrats. And I'll show you one more example. Next slide. And there are a few more like this, but I'll stop here. Freedom versus fairness. You can make the argument that the core principle of the Democratic Party is one of fairness. The core principle of the Republican Party is one of freedom. It is night and day. Republicans are focused on freedom, Democrats focused on fairness, and so there is no common ground. I don't like this partisanship. I'm getting beaten up right now because of something I said last week about trying to bring these people together. But after finishing this survey, this was done last week, I now realize why it exists.
Can I chime in just on one point about this polling question and what it means?
Briefly, because I want to get
Very
Danny,
briefly.
and then we can...
Democrats passionately believe in freedom. The question asks, and I think every American actually believes we are the freest, greatest country on earth. What the question asks is, should America have more freedom or fairness? If you are satisfied with the level of freedom in America and you believe you have it, and you're black and Latino and you're seeing a world of opportunity that didn't exist for your parents, you want more fairness and to be treated fairly. You've embraced freedom. You're where you are because of freedom. I don't think this is driving a difference in attitudes. I think the question has a nuance beneath the surface that misrepresents a divide here, if you will, in the result and the interpretation, because it would be wrong to leave on the table the notion that Democrats don't passionately believe in freedom.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think there's a bit of a
No,
false choice, but I want to get,
if
we're going to
he's
come back to it. I want to get Dan Schnur in.
You're not going to give me a shot at responding.
No,
if he's
not
going
right
to
now.
attack.
Not right now.
That's fair.
You've already got your
You must
slide.
be-
I believe in
you must be a
freedom. I
Democrat.
believe in the freedom of the moderator. Dan Schnur,
You
weigh
know who
in.
he voted for.
We're in where you want to.
Listen, I'm eager to go on to a conversation about demographics and cultural and their impact on politics. I think on a day in which the first active major professional athlete comes out of the closet and is met not with derision but with acclaim is proof positive toward one of Joel's points.
Do people know about that news?
For those of you who have not seen it, Jason Collins, the 12-year National Basketball Association player, this morning became the first active professional athlete in a major sport in the United States to announce that he was gay. And almost immediately, he was met by a great deal of support from other professional athletes. And to me, that suggests cultural and demographic shifts that drive the politics that Joel and Frank are talking about. But real quick, I want to get to Frank's point on partisanship because I think it's an important one. We can have another discussion than the one here today on political reform and why we should elect people to office who do not just represent the ideological basis of their respective parties, but can and ought to work across party lines. Frank talks appropriately about the obstacles to that. I want to mention one obstacle, and that's this, my iPhone. The best thing about my iPhone is that it's empowering. I can listen to whatever I want to, I can watch whatever I want to, whenever I want to. When I tell my students at USC about rushing home from dinner to watch my favorite television program, or punching buttons on the car radio looking for my favorite song, I might as well be talking to them about the buggy whip and my favorite blacksmith because they have no idea what I'm talking about. But if the best thing about this device is that it's empowering, this is the worst thing about it. Because as soon as I put those white plugs in my ears, not only can I listen to whatever I want to, but I very quickly lose any interest in what anyone else is listening to. Now, Matt, as many of you know from listening to him on NPR, left, right, and center, KCRW, you're welcome. Matt, as you may know, is an aficionado of gangster rap music. Not the mellow, mainstream Jay-Z stuff, but the really hardcore Get the Police. Yeah, I know it's not Get the Police. In years past, if Matt and I commuted to work together, we would take turns listening to each other's music. I would listen to his gangster rap. He would listen to my Gilbert and Sullivan, because that's how I roll.
I actually love Gilbert and Sullivan.
I know you do. We might not change each other's minds, but at least we're exposed to what the other person is listening to. And so Frank's points are valid, and again, I do really want to get back to the demographic and cultural discussion that Matt opened. But I think Frank makes such an important point. we are divided. We're divided because of the way our congressional districts are drawn. We're divided because we are the most mobile society in world history. But we're divided because we want to be. And it's only human nature. When you're a smart person, you want to listen to, you want to read, and you want to talk to the smartest people in the world. Who are the smartest people in the world? The people who agree with me. And some people think those people reside on MSNBC, some think they reside on Fox, but until you're willing to break out of your ideological cul-de-sac, the unfortunate consequence is the data that Frank was presenting.
I want to get Harold Ford into this conversation. Take it where you will on any of this, the meaning of 2012, and I know you've got a special focus on the budget challenges, so if you have a unified field theory that will unite all those things into a grand bargain in the budget,
right? I
share
think,
it now.
No, well, I listen to Michael Jackson and Prince. I'll get my playlist over to you, Dan, before we leave, and Matt. I'd say two quick things. I want to hear Frank respond to Joel. There is no doubt the country is divided, but let's not kid ourselves. Joel and Frank both have done polling. We don't have lopsided presidential races. I mean, it sometimes looks lopsided because of the electoral vote, but the country is really a 50-50 country. If 330 or 340,000 Republicans scattered around a few states, important states, would have voted differently, we might have had a different outcome even in this presidential race. One can argue that if the Republicans could have been able to settle on a single, perhaps criminal definition of rape, had they not talked incessantly about abortion, and had they adopted Bush light on immigration, they might not have lost so many Senate seats and might have been more competitive in the presidential race. I disagree with you slightly about demographics. I don't think there's any doubt the demographics have changed in a dramatic way. You look at the presidential race 30 years ago, and if Mitt Romney had scored what he did this year with white voters, he'd be president because the numbers are very different. Mitt Romney made the point after the race, or even during the race, that President Obama promised things to these poor Americans and people of color, and that's why he won. Well, that's what politics is all about. And when you look at the most recent data where household income, wealth amongst people of color, brown and black in this country, has fallen over the last 4 to 6 years, naturally they're going to be listening more tunely to candidates who speak to those issues. But I'm not as pessimistic by some of this, because I think these numbers have existed for a while. I think we could go back, and Frank, I'd challenge you even to go back and look at some of your polling and some other polling to see where Republicans stood on religious issues or Democrats may have stood on those issues, and for that matter, get a chance to see who's more open or tolerant and who's may, in their mind, be a little less tolerant. I do think that Joel's description of fairness and freedom is probably a fair one. But I just believe more than anything, there's just a leadership void in politics today. There's a great book by a guy named Ira Shapiro, if you're bored out of your mind, called The Last Great Senate, which you ought to take a peek at. And he talks about the great producers in the Senate over the last 100 years. He cites Teddy Kennedy as perhaps the most productive because he understood as a big ideologue that he had to get things done. We're lacking and missing that group of people in the Senate. There's nothing wrong with having a very strong opinion, but there seems to be a real reluctance for some reason to not want to work together, not want to compromise. Matter of fact, you lose your seat if you compromise. And it's going to take a president, it's going to take a majority leader, minority leader, speaker, and a majority leader, minority leader in the House, respectively, to help change this. I was in college in 1991, and a young fellow named Bill Clinton came along when Democrats thought we had no chance to win. He was country, he was Southern, he had a great accent, was a believer that you had to return to mainstream, to the Democratic side and talk about middle-class values. If Republicans figure out how to talk about middle-class values again, how to talk about making it possible for every American to succeed, I think they'll find themselves in a better position, and the country's dialogue will. I want Democrats to keep beating y'all, but I want you to be stronger, because the country is stronger when there's a big conversation and it's not a lopsided win. Right now, we can beat Republicans with a hand tied behind our back because you're so wrong on the social issue.
At the national level, not at the state level, though, right?
Well, I'll take even our chances.
Most of the governorships now are Republican, 30, right? 32?
Right, but that switch. I'll take the presidency any day of the week. Over that. I'm talking about national elections, in fairness, Matt, exactly. And I don't believe going forward, just the generational divide, it just favors us. And until Republicans get right on some of those issues, it's bad for the country, and I don't see them winning at the national level for a period of time.
Frank, you've been so patient. Do you want to jump back in on this and on the values thing? The other thing I toss into the mix is, I'm always convinced when I look at the political scientists who write about the difference between, there's this debate about whether we're more polarized than we used to be or whether we're just sorted. The parties have sorted, people self-identify now, and that's what's driving this. And that there's actually guys like Morris Fiorina at Stanford and others, there's a whole school of thought that even on some of these controversial issues, there's a lot more common ground than some of the data you're sharing suggests. But go ahead, take it where you will.
If you could pull up slide 25, please. One more of these.
Slide 25.
To respond over here.
No, you've done it.
The difference between how you define the problems facing America. Republicans blame individuals for not doing enough, for not taking personal responsibility to do the right thing. Democrats blame corporations. Republicans do not blame corporations. Democrats do not blame individuals. And they both have an equal criticism of government. On every one of these core issues, we have sorted ourselves the way that you describe it. And you can see that the American people are somewhat torn over, which is a greater problem. Look, they don't work together in Washington. There's a reason why Congress has an 11% job approval rating. 11%. Gaddafi had a 14% job approval rating, and that was among the people who killed him. Until these people understand and both speak the language of the American people, which frankly Mitt Romney did not do. And Barack Obama is great at it. Barack Obama is the best teleprompter reader that we have ever had in the White House. Mitt Romney? Stevie Wonder read a teleprompter better than Mitt Romney. But I never said that Democrats were against freedom. You might say Republicans are against fairness, but I never said that Democrats are against freedom. If I asked you in this room, how many of you think you're more or less free today than you were, say, 10 years ago? Who thinks you've got more freedom today than you had 10 years ago? Raise your hands. Look at how few hands have gone up here.
How many people think you have the same amount of freedom you had 10 years ago?
And who thinks you have less freedom today than 10 years ago?
Who's a Republican?
But you just proved my point, Matt.
Right.
You just exactly proved the point. If you feel like you've got less freedom, you tend to be a Republican. If you feel like you have more freedom, you tend to be a Democrat. But we're not going to solve it based on issues. We're going to solve it based on values, based on core beliefs. And this is not something, unfortunately, that our job, Joel, you and me as pollsters, Dan as a strategist, we tend to find the divisions rather than the unity. We tend to find the friction points rather than the things that bring us together.
Look, let's talk about some of the values that we actually do share that had a big point in this election and I think have an influence going forward in terms of the democracy and how do we solve some of our toughest problems. I actually do believe Republicans believe in fairness, Frank. It's why actually President Obama did very well with moderates and in fact won moderates by 6 points more than George Bush did the last time a Republican won the White House. But the economic values that shifted on the part of Americans, along with their social values, do go to a sense of fairness. You'll notice that 6 out of 10 Americans there, if you look at the bottom 2 buckets on Frank's data slide, feel that neither corporations and powerful institutions or governments are serving individuals well enough. And people's sense of fairness has been undermined in the last 8 years during an economic period that's created more anxiety and turmoil for them, even for middle-class voters who are now more consumed with whether I can stay in place instead of climbing ahead. And for us as a country, when 74% of Americans, we did a survey right after the election, a national survey, my firm did it. When 74% of Americans think that businesses and corporations are no longer aligned with their interests, we've got a gap in our workplace and in our economic system that we've got to resolve from education on up around fairness, durability, long-term investments, things that 70% of Americans all agree we need to do for our future. Those are also values that were very much in play, and I think are in play with this different demographic group we have. Last point on this. America is and always has been a centrist country. And if we fall into the trap of an ideological discussion and debate that Washington can exercise so easily, we're missing a big point. We were founded by people who took on the King of England, the most powerful central force in history. And we stood up to that and built a system that was designed very much not to have strong centralized authority. And our close presidential elections occur because we are very centrist. We have only had, we haven't had one landslide election hitting 55%, only one in the last 30 years when Ronald Reagan won in 1984.
I want to get Harold back in. I want to pull on a theme that you started to raise, I think, which is, in some sense, you know, when I talk to Democrats, I get a sense that there's a almost an overconfidence about the demographic shift that we're seeing, that we're on the side of history. And yet something you said made me think that you think there's a vulnerability, because if Democrats have the rhetoric and the kind of headline appeal and thematic appeal on different issues that appeal to the rising majority, but don't really have public policy answers to wage stagnation, wealth issues, education, if the Republicans got their act together and actually came up with an agenda that was more equal, or they could compete in a way that was equal to these sets of economic and social challenges, it's not like the Democrats have the quote-unquote answers to these huge forces of globalization, technological change that are really making people feel anxious and insecure.
I think the Democrats have a large number of these answers. One of the big challenges, you can't get much done in Washington. Aside from that, I agree with you. The premise of your point, which Republicans don't seem to be offering anything new, anything interesting, anything dynamic, anything enterprising, anything entrepreneurial, and as a result, the place just kind of stands still. It is amazing to me that after all this time talking about trying to get a large budget deal, that we can't seem to get one. Now, I do agree that we've created $2.3 trillion in savings through tax increases and other savings this president has in his Congress. But the reality is, we've got to do this, I think, in a far more balanced way. And it's amazing to me, with as many people yelling about it, as many people talking about it, the challenges the country's gone through the last 5 years, that we've been unable to find a way to find some sort of agreement around these big issues. I don't disagree with either of you guys, and I think the polling will continue, and we'll learn more and more about the sentiment of the country. But I remember Bill Clinton, I remember asking him one time, how do you grade polling? He goes, I look at polling in ways to figure out where people are and figure out how I can take people where I want to go. And I hope that this next generation of leadership in the Senate and the House and at every level begins to look at polling that way, as opposed to saying, I'm right and you're wrong. Look at the polling. It says I'm right and you're wrong. Now, that may be the case, but how do you take the polling and figure out we're all trying to get here? I'd have a question for Frank, one question for Frank. Do you think Democrats and Republicans disagree so violently that we don't want a grand bargain, that we don't want legislation around guns that make the country safer, that we don't want a health care plan that actually affords people an opportunity, access to care? Or do you think we're so diametrically opposed even on those fronts? Because if we are, then we really won't get anywhere if we don't all agree that there's an income inequality challenge in the country. There's a challenge where poor kids don't get educated nearly as well as kids from affluent households. Now, we can disagree on how to do it, but if you're telling me, and you and Joel both are saying that we're so divergent there, then that I think we're at a unique and unprecedented place in the country if that is the case. Does your polling suggest that?
No. The issue is what you just raised, which is how do you get there? Are you going to raise taxes to get to that point? Are you going to cut spending to balance the budgets you want to do? Are you going to affect Social Security and Medicare? The problem is that we've now learned through our profession to destroy politicians who come up with specific answers. I'm watching the situation in immigration. Where I got into trouble last week is I support immigration reform, as do the vast majority of Americans. Talk radio does not. And I was dumb enough to do a speech at a university where someone tape recorded the conversation when I said that talk radio was undermining the ability to get things done. Well, that has a consequence to me. We agree on those policy principles. Where we disagree is on how to get there, and on the left and on the right, and it is the same, Harold.
I agree.
We destroy the center as a way to say no. And one last statistical point. Over 80% of Americans, of NRA members, support the legislation that the Democratic senator from West Virginia, the background checks, and a couple other points. NRA members, we polled this. And I will tell you, I've had more shit, and I know I'm not supposed to use that language, but more shit from the NRA for telling the truth. Our process is designed to undermine those who seemingly move to the center. And so whereas we agree on principle, we don't agree on how to get there.
I want to get Dan in. Take it where you will.
I want to go to Senator to be Ford's point here.
I like the way you introduced me.
On campus, I run what is called the USC Dornsife LA Times poll. And at the height of the budget crisis about a year and a half ago, we asked Californians precisely the question that you put to Frank. And what we found is that by overwhelming majorities, Democrats and Republicans alike wanted their elected leadership to compromise on a budget agreement. Then we asked them what they wanted that compromise to look like. And Democrats made it clear in overwhelming numbers that it was not to include significant spending cuts, and Republicans made it clear in equally overwhelming numbers that it was not to include significant tax increases. So the lesson that I take from public opinion research, and I will defer to Frank and Joel on this, is that everybody wants compromise as long as it's the other side that is compromising. And that leads to two imperatives. Number one, going back to the point that Harold made a bit earlier about leadership. I have no percentage in criticizing either President Obama or his immediate predecessor. But I'll point back to one verbal formulation that President Clinton used when he was in office, talking about a very, very divisive issue. Whenever Bill Clinton talked about abortion, he made a point of saying that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And what he's doing through that word choice is he's signaling to people who disagree with him that he respects their opinion. Similarly, in the immediate aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting, and Joel can talk to this greater authority than me, Clinton gave a speech, if I'm not mistaken, to Democratic donors and activists, the base of the party, and said essentially, I come from Arkansas. The people with whom you are so angry are my neighbors. And when you talk about gun control, they hear you threatening their way of life. Now, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but when you take the Clintons, when you take the Reagans, you identify the kind of leadership that recognizes what a polarized society we have, but recognizes the obligation to rise above that polarization. That's what leadership is, and that's why I think Harold's initial point is such an important one.
I want to toss something else into the mix, Joel, which is Dan Yankelovich, who's kind of one of the godfathers of the polling profession and a good friend, had this great line, which I always loved. He said that pollsters have become incredibly expert at measuring every little fluctuation and jot and tittle in public opinion as it goes forward, but we're doing nothing, not just the polling profession, but as a society, to improve the quality of public opinion. I raise this because when you look at things like the budget debate, which we're talking about, and we should talk separately about why it's not a jobs debate as opposed to just a long-term deficit debate, because that's the immediate crisis, but it's clear that the Republicans on the right are in total denial of math and demography. You can't double the number of seniors on Social Security and Medicare, which we're going to do, and have taxes lower than they were as a share of GDP when Ronald Reagan was president. It cannot work. Similarly, Democrats are kidding themselves if you think we should have Medicare expanding at rates where we're already spending orders of magnitude more per capita on healthcare than any other healthcare system in the world without better outcomes, and that all the money that's excess going to Medicare that's not needed for quality care is money that liberals can't invest in poor children. Until each side, or until we find a way as a society to explain those things, how are we ever going to reach consensus? And then where does that public education come from?
So I think, and this is probably an area Frank and I reached consensus on in the speaker's room before we came out here, and it goes back to what Harold was saying a minute ago about this book, which I haven't read yet, on the Senate. Look, we haven't really talked about what happens in Congress in a way you would all talk about it in business. All the folks who are in business know that there are incentives and disincentives to certain actions. We right now have a legislative system that has disincentives for compromising. District lines are drawn in a way so that if you're in the House of Representatives, the only thing you worry about politically is in a primary from the extreme left or extreme right with 55 districts in the middle who are the only ones who ever have to worry about the other side. That is a disincentive for compromise. We have an outdated mechanism in the Senate called the filibuster, which instead of forcing people to work together, now allows 41 senators to block anything.
It rewards them.
What's that?
It rewards them.
And rewards them, actually, for blocking things. So you have a tremendous disincentive in the system for compromise and solving some of these tough problems and having the kind of leadership conversation that you're talking about. And I'll just add one note on the polling side. We've worked for presidents, governors, mayors. There is not an executive in the political sphere who doesn't see their numbers go down on approval ratings when they get bollocksed up with their legislative body. You look at the strongest executives. Now, I'm from the East Coast. You look at Andrew Cuomo and Chris Christie. They both avoid getting into the muck with their legislative bodies, and their numbers have remained high. That's because all throughout our system, that is a disincentive for compromise, disincentive for breaking the logjam.
So since you mentioned, and Matt, thank you, Matt, since you mentioned Christie, based on y'all's polling, here you got a Republican governor in a Democratic state whose numbers are soaring. We're 6 months today, Hurricane Sandy affecting New York, New Jersey, the tri-state area. How do you explain his success in light of those numbers? Is it solely because of how he stood up and brought President Obama in, or they stood side by side right before the election? Or is there something else there? Because he won a race in a Democratic state, so he clearly is doing something a little differently than some Republicans and even some Democrats.
He's an amazing speaker. Is anyone here from New Jersey? This guy, wherever Chris Christie goes, he brings people to their feet, which is ironic because he hasn't seen his own feet in 6 years.
Frank, you're going to get in trouble again.
Got all these
I have 3 more of those. If you don't want to hear
this
them,
one's being filmed too, Frank.
Yeah, there's another one. If you want to hear a few more of those, 3:45. Actually, for the language, 3:45 this afternoon. If you don't want to hear it, don't show up. Chris Christie is so direct and so in your face, and frankly, so representative of a straightforwardness that New Jersey is known for. He doesn't mince words. He says, and I quote, "Your vacation is over, get off the beach." He tells people the way it is. Now, here's the question. I don't know if Americans can get yelled at for 2 years and still like him as much at the end, but I will tell you that we're looking for someone who doesn't read a speech, doesn't use a teleprompter, is in your face, and says what he means and means what he says, and you know that he means it. And he does so in such clear, concise, direct language that we have not had a politician like him really since Harry Truman. And that's what allows him to appeal on the left and on the right. New Jersey has got all sorts of budgetary problems, and he's close to 60%, 70% at one point job approval. Right. It's because he works with Democrats when he can. He'll argue with them when he can't. He'll make a deal, and he will compromise, and he'll tell it to the people straight. He'll look them straight in the eye and say the way it is. It's amazing.
Can you tell me, before we leave Christie, can you name one tough truth he's told his own conservative base that they need to accept, that they don't want to hear?
He's been harsh. Well, yeah, the first thing is that he embraced Obama, and when the Republicans, 5 days before the election, started giving him crap, he told them to go straight to hell.
I don't think that's a tough truth. He's asking his conservatives, that's doing his politics before the election.
Let me ask you a question. 5 days before the, hold on. Let me finish just once. 5 days before the election, telling your own party in public on national television to chill out and accept the fact that your opposing president of the United States has done a good job on this issue and he should be supported. You don't think that that's tough talk? You don't think that that's saying something that nobody wanted to hear?
I don't think that's what Matt asked him.
No. What I'm asking is, will he tell Republican primary voters that when we double the number of people who are over 65, taxes are going to have to go up somewhat, even as we also cut these spending programs? When I hear that, I'll view him as a courageous truth teller. I want to talk about 2014, Harold, because we got a couple minutes left. Get your questions ready, because I want to leave ample time for Q&A. One of the questions I have, this is sort of the theme of, a little bit in the theme of Democratic overconfidence. Midterms tend to be much older electorate, much whiter electorate. Are the Democrats, do the Democrats think that they can win back the House? What are you looking for as you look toward 2014, given the demographics we've talked about? I want to get you in on this also.
I'd like to see a deal. I do give one example. I think what he was asking was public policy, and I do think the outreach to Cory Booker there is an example, but there's a political advantage for Christie to be aligned with Cory, but they have been able to come together around one or two things. It'll be interesting to see if around pension liability and taxes, if he's willing to do that as well, and the jury's still out on that. 2014, I remember being on a show with Ron Brownstein on Morning Joe, sitting over here to my right, to y'all's left, and right after the 2008 elections, so about this time, 2009, and you were talking about Colorado, talking about a number of states where Democrats were very excited and confident about our chances to hold seats, win new seats. In some of those places we did, but we ended up losing control of the House and losing some seats in the Senate. Midterms are funny things, and I think people are going to be looking for some results between now and 14. I think people are going to be looking for some leadership out of Washington between now and 14. And there's no doubt the point that Joel just raised is the scariest thing, I think, for those of us who care about outcomes in politics. It's the primaries. When I was in Congress, which doesn't seem that long ago, but it's a long time ago now, you were more worried about a general opponent than you were a primary opponent. Now, these guys, men and women, are worried about someone in their party running against them. So I think that has to be looked at very closely. If you listen to Joe Manchin, he and Pat Toomey, you referenced him earlier on the gun stuff, Manchin thinks we ought to wait a little bit before we bring up gun safety legislation again to allow some of these deadlines to pass so Democrats and Republicans can avoid not a tough general opponent, but a tough primary opponent before he may bring up guns again. So I think you got to look at that, one. And two, you never know. I would not have thought 3 weeks ago that the FAA, that we would have broken some of the sequester stuff to fund the FAA to make it easier for people to travel. I was a victim of the sequester cuts as well as I'm sure many in the room were.
Wasn't that because the congressman needed to fly home?
No doubt about it. So if you make this very personal for them, they may change. Who would have thought 4 weeks ago that we'll be talking about terrorism to the extent that we're talking about now because of the tragedy and the strength and the resiliency that people in Boston have shown? So there are going to be a number of things will happen between now and 14 that will help determine that. But from a tactical process standpoint, I think you got to look at the primaries. And two, I think you got to look at what's the next step around a sequester. People feel like they have to make changes. Is it a defense? Is it a discretionary program? I don't know what that may be.
Joe?
I'll be very brief so we can get to questions. I think it's too soon to say. Mid-year elections have their own dynamic. It's why in 2006 the Democrats can have enormous gains, and in 2010 the Republicans do. It is not a predictable, projectable electorate the way a presidential electorate is. The anomalies that can occur in the off years are not necessarily consistent. They are generally older and whiter, but I think it's too soon to say what 2014's electorate will look like and what will be driving them.
Dan?
I think given historical trends, but also given the kind of turnout models that Matt's talking about, it's going to be very, very difficult for Republicans to lose control of the House of Representatives next year. That said, I think the dynamic that we're beginning to see, and it goes back to something that the other panelists have talked about, is a mirror image of the politics we saw in much of the 1970s and 80s, where Democrats controlled the House of Representatives even after losing presidential election after election after election, and they used the House as sort of false comfort, and it made them intellectually and ideologically self-satisfied in a way that perpetuated their losing streak in presidential elections. And I think as Republicans continue to cling to a majority in the House of Representatives, it becomes very easy for the base of the party to say, no, we don't have to change. We don't have to adjust. We don't have to look at the new political and demographic and societal realities because after all, we have the House of Representatives. I think it's worth remembering that after the 1988 election, when George Bush Sr., or as you now call him, George Bush Classic, was elected president over Michael Dukakis, the Republicans then had won the popular vote in 5 of the 6 previous presidential elections, the same way Democrats have now. And Joel and Harold can speak to this better than me, but it's worth remembering that in 1989 and 1990, Democratic Party activists and congressional members did not rise up as one and say, holy smokes, we need to be more moderate. It took a very skilled candidate and the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, to wrench the Democratic Party from its moorings. Say we are not going to abandon the principles of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy, but we're going to update them for a new political reality. The challenge for Republicans, it seems to me, is rather than getting lost in the false comfort of a majority in the House of Representatives, to continue that search for a Republican who's willing to speak the same hard truths to his or her party's base that Bill Clinton did to the Democratic Party base a generation ago. And Frank Luntz is in a much better position than me to tell you whether that truth sayer will arrive on the scene in 2016, 2020, or 2024.
Great closing comment. Let's go to questions. I see Congresswoman Jane Harman there. I think we have a microphone that goes around. Tell us who you are. We know who you are.
Hi, great panel. Really interesting. My question is, based on what you said about Christie, and I agree, whether it's possible for anyone in the House or Senate to be the equivalent of a Christie, given the way the primaries are set up. I'm talking about either party, and given the way the caucuses are set up, and given the way the leaders are elected in the House or Senate, do we have to kind of accept the incredible shrinking Congress in our near-term future and then look to state houses and mayors for the leaders of America?
Thoughts?
Well, it's on the Democratic side, we're going to see whether someone from Congress can emerge to challenge either Secretary of State Clinton or Vice President Biden. And I don't know, I'll leave that to you guys on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, I'm watching Marco Rubio, who is arguably one of the bright lights. You can agree or disagree with him, but he's taken the country by storm. He delivered the response, and he is now a punching bag for talk radio because he's trying to sit down and find some sort of solution for immigration. He is living proof that if you're going to try to find consensus from behind you, you're going to get hit in the head again and again and again. And that's one of the reasons why I'm pessimistic about where we are right now.
Any quick thoughts on that, Harold?
First of all, Jane Harman is one of the great paragons and examples of what's needed more in Congress. Your leadership is missed, and on foreign policy matters, intelligence matters, and domestic policy. She's at the Woodrow Wilson Center now and does a great job. Answer your question, I don't know of anybody in the House and the Senate that can do it. It's not organized for them to do it. As you all know, they would get either one of two things would happen. They'd lose their leadership posts or they'd lose their committee posts. This has got to come from outside. The same happened in the Congress. I would differ slightly with Dan. The Democratic Leadership Council emerged, which is really, I chaired that organization for a short period of time. Congresswoman Harman was a member of it, and Bill Clinton was really the face, the force, and the purpose of it, along with the founder, Al Fromm.
This gentleman, tell us who you are, and then a quick question.
Sure. Stoney Burke. I'm with Southern Company. We're an energy company out of the Southeast. But what I
Y'all
really
do energy, right?
Yeah, just a little bit. What I really enjoy is a panel on changing demographics where the white male audience member can ask a panel of all majority white males a question, and I'll take that a step further.
Two black guys who look white too.
Exactly. We take it a step further where there's been no discussion about women. And for Frank, I guess it's binders full of women. But there's a narrative in the Republican Party, particularly Republican governors, where you do have more Republican governors. You even have more Republican women governors that are Indian American descent, Mexican American descent, and then of course Jane Brewer in Arizona. Why can't Republicans, do a better job of bringing more women into the party when instead they have, Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann as, the leading spokespersons on their side of the aisle when you have great candidates at the governor level to speak?
First off, I am a minority. I'm a Jewish Republican. There aren't many of us. There are a few more now than there used to be. As far as women, we asked the question, what attribute do you want the most from in your life? Similar to the questions we put up there. The attribute that women ask for more than anything else is control of their life. Now think about it. When two Republican Senate candidates basically say, and I'm going to use harsh language, that rape is God's will, how the hell does that communicate that women have control of their life? As long as Republicans have people that use that kind of language, that are willing to say these things in public, and the candidate from Missouri then says that God came to him one night and told him he should stay in the race. Well, God came to me the same night and told me to tell him to get the hell out. The best way to do it is for female candidates, not for us to do it, but for female Republicans to talk, and not just in issues that affect women. I'd argue that we will be in better shape as a country if we find those issues that transcend gender, transcend age, transcend region of the country, transcend all of this, and focus on day-to-day lives, day-to-day concerns of day-to-day people.
Yeah.
And now for the opposing point of view.
You got a quick thought on that?
Quick comment. Again, I look at 2004, 2008 a lot, where George Bush won and Mitt Romney lost. One of the other places where there was a profound difference, not just among moderates, was George Bush only lost women overall by 3 points. Mitt Romney lost them by 11. I think in part because of what Frank was talking about, and significantly. But women are very focused on economic issues. In two-income households now, in 48% of them, women are the top earner, right? Issues around education that link up to their kids' future as well as their own ability to succeed and keep advancing in the workplace. You have to be able to have a meaningful conversation with them on their economic values as well as some of the social values. And it was the biggest gender gap in history that helped us get to a 51% majority in the election, because we had the help from those candidates that Frank mentioned, but we talked to them about education and economic issues all the way through.
This gentleman over here.
The Foss of MidOcean Partners. I have a question, really, slide 25 evoked a lot of discussion over the role of the corporation versus individuals and culpability, if you will. The question is, can you parse that data more along the lines of per capita income, which might show greater insight as to how different groups view?
Yes, in fact, then if you pull up slide 26, because this actually does it to some degree, and I'm going to do this at 3:45 this afternoon. The challenge for both political parties is that people who define themselves as middle class, it is dropping over time. That more people feel like they're falling out, that they haven't quite gotten it. And the reason why, and this is a definition, Democrats, the number one thing in defining unfair is some wealthy Americans pay a lower rate of tax than middle-class Americans. That to them is the definition, the core definition of unfairness. To Republicans, it's Americans are working hard to make ends meet, and they're paying the welfare of somebody else. When we actually target different people and say that's the individual who's unfair, or that corporation is unfair, it goes deeper than just language. And it goes to how they view society and whether there's anyone standing up for them and speaking out for them and defending them. There's a reason why Richard Branson is so, I say this with Rupert Murdoch having his panel across the hall, why Richard Branson is such a popular CEO. And there's certain ones that stand out because they are seen as fighting for their employees, as fighting for the underdog. And the higher up in income, the less concerned you are about that fighting, and the more concerned you are about defending where you are. The lower you are on that income scale, the more hostile you are to corporations and corporate leaders because you think nobody speaks for you.
Before I get this gentleman in, what percentage here with independent aren't captured by this? Is it a third?
No, it's higher. It's almost 40%.
So 40% of the electorate is not reflected in any of the values discussion you're talking about in these things. I just want to be clear on that. This gentleman, what's your question? Tell us who you are.
Hi, everybody. Todd Flora from nearby Santa Monica. We may be a centrist nation, but we don't draw centrist districts.
We don't what?
We don't draw centrist districts. My concern as, a Democrat like you who's actually for entitlement reform is that there's no incentive to be anything other than, strident on the left and strident on the right because you're never going to lose.
Let me get Dan on this.
It is an absolutely terrific question, and Joel, to his credit, addressed it a little bit earlier, but let me underscore the point he made. If I'm elected to Congress, Democrat or Republican, in 46 of the 50 states, I know that I can hold that seat for as long as I want. And I can do anything I want. I can lie, I can cheat, I can steal, I can commit fraud, I can commit forgery, I can hide cash money in the freezer department of my refrigerator, and I can commit the kind of moral atrocities with my own staff that would make a grown man blush. And my district will still send me back to Congress because it's been gerrymandered to be safe for one party or the other. One correction, one exception. I'll never lose a general election campaign. But to Joel's earlier point, I can lose a primary. So what does that tell you? A congressman can lie, cheat, or steal and keep that job for as long as they want. The one thing they can't do is compromise. They can't cooperate. They can't reach out across party lines because then they will face a more ideological extreme member of their own party. Here in California, as you know, as a Santa Monican, we've adopted redistricting reform, which takes the process away from the politicians, which is a good first step. The second thing we've done, the voters in their wisdom have enacted a top two primary, which allows the top two finishers, regardless of party, to go on to a general election and encourages not just more centrist, but more responsive legislators and congressional members. The last leg of the stool is campaign finance reform, but that's the least interesting topic in America, so we'll save it for another day.
Last question we've got. One more time. This gentleman here, tell us who you are. Very quick question.
Herman Santos, I'm an immigrant, so that will be my introduction here. But my question is, a lot of experts are saying that the way to get the Latinos back into the Republican Party is immigration reform. But in reality, I believe that unless the Republican Party deals with education, I mean, we have our students coming out with $200,000 in student debt. Healthcare, the Republicans wants to repeal healthcare.
So your question, sir, is?
My question is that something that you think, based on the polls, that will attract the Latinos or just the immigration reform?
Quick answer.
The segment of society that is most supportive of significant education reform, parental choice in education, charter schools, opportunity scholarships, a complete overturn of the current establishment in education. The Hispanic and Latino communities support that more than any other community in America. The problem with the GOP is that they think it's a state and local issue, and so they won't talk about it nationally. It's one of the reasons why the GOP does so well on state elections. Why Republicans get elected for governor, but they're not doing well on the national level, is because they talk about that specific kind of reform. And if you're interested, I will have this afternoon the specific language on that, on education reform, that might be helpful to you.
10 seconds, final thoughts from all of our folks from this whole set of yeasty things. What do you want to leave people with as they head forward? Something that's life-changing.
I think in business and in politics, be very aware of what the generational divide means. in this country. It's going to shape our country for several decades to come, politically and economically, and you need to be connected with those folks, not be on the wrong side of the divide with them.
Dan Schnur, 10 seconds.
I talked earlier about politics in an iPod nation, how polarized a community and how polarized a society we've become. You can change the way districts are drawn, you can change the way campaigns are financed, you can reach out to better, smarter, more principled elected officials. Ultimately, it comes down to us. If you really, really want to change politics, then we have to all be willing to take the white plugs out of our ears. The last thing I tell my students every semester is if you're a principled conservative, I want you to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. If you're a principled liberal, I want you to read George Will or David Brooks once a week. We're not trying to change your minds, just to open them. That's what changes politics.
Enter every political conversation with the massive understanding you could be wrong and listen, much like you're suggesting, Dan. 2, anybody that comes to you and wants a political contribution, ask them why they want to run, and 2, will they compromise with the opposite party if they're elected? And 3, if you know young people who want to enter politics, please discourage them from going on the fundraising side, encourage them to go on the public policy side.
And a last word from Frank Luntz, although you can hear more from Frank at 3:45.
Yes, I'm
That's
always
the third advertisement for Frank's panel later. 10 seconds from now.
It's not what you say, it's what people hear. What matters is what your audience hears from you, what you communicate. Don't focus on your words, focus on how they receive them.
Give Matt Miller a round of applause.
That's all the time we've got time for today. Thank our panel.